The world of House of 1000 Corpses is one that is like our own reality, but is distinctly not our reality. A strange desert alternate history of the late American 1970s, where violence is a universal language understood by all, where the law of the land is one of force, and a mutual understanding that everyone in their heart has the capacity for great evil. A car rides in the night proclaiming to anyone who cares to read it that God is dead. A phone booth has a flyer displaying that a family is missing their dog's head. A news anchor on an old black and white television says that an entire cheerleading team from the nearby high school is still missing without a trace. And somewhere far out of town, an old man and a clown converse in a roadside attraction of curiosities and illusions, before being stood up by two local rednecks from town. This is a normal night for this place, a common occurrence. One not even to be feared, but instead laughed at in the absurdity of it all, and then simply mopped up and moved on from once the excitement is over. The kind of world that would later in the film be summed when Captain Spaulding the roadside clown would say, "A place where life and death are both meaningless, and pain is God." The late 90s and early 2000s were the peak of Rob Zombie's career. After the dissolution of White Zombie near the end of the 90s and rebranding successfully into a solo artist, with two back-to-back hit horror-themed albums, he began to show an interest in exploring other art forms outside of music. He had been directing his own music videos for years at this point, and been the general creative director on a lot of White Zombie products, and almost ended up being the director of The Crow 3. But eventually left the film after it was stuck in development hell for 18 months, at which point he primarily partnered with Universal, where he helped design attractions for and promote their Halloween Horror Nights that were at this time slowly dying in popularity. He is largely seen as the figure that saved that event, and is probably the reason that they're still ongoing every year, still to this day. As he put it when speaking on these events in the mid-2000s, about how everything in his life converged into House of 1000 Corpses, he would say, "I always loved horror movies that involved fucked up families. Texas Chainsaw was family for that. But there was Spider Baby, anything that was a messed up family unit. I think that's why I was fascinated by Manson, because it had that vibe. I was working at Universal in 1999 for their Halloween Horror Nights, and I designed a maze based on the Hellbilly Deluxe album of the time, and it was a success. And I started meeting with people from the Universal system. They were talking about this computer-animated Frankenstein film that they were working on, and I was trying to get involved with that. The project never took off, even though they did tons of work. Ultimately, House of 1000 Corpses had its initial idea as an attraction for Halloween Horror Nights. And when you think about it, that kind of makes a lot of sense. Which this origin of starting out with the structure of a theme park in mind does have both good and bad consequences on the film that they would end up making, which is something that we're going to get into. He would say, "It was one of those things where I saw it and thought, this is so cool they will never make it." At the time I did the Halloween maze, Universal was talking about the next years, so I thought we'd do a scary house, House of 1000 Corpses. Once I had the title in my head, I started coming up with a story for a haunted house. But then I ended up meeting and I pitched it as a movie and they loved it. By the time the next Halloween rolled around, we'd already shot the film and built the attraction now based on the film. Unfortunately at that moment, Stacy Snyder, the chairman of Universal, had gotten pulled into Congress to testify and Lieberman was up everyone's asses, yada yada. So Universal changed the name of the attraction to The American Nightmare. What he's referring to there, of course, is the early 2000s congressional hearings related to marketing violence towards children, in which basically the executives of practically every movie studio, video game company, music distributor, and television network were subpoenaed to come to Washington to answer bullshit questions designed to scapegoat America's issues onto the entertainment media that we all consume in that post-Columbine world. He would later say to The Guardian, "I was in the office of the head of production or something, and he asked me if I had any movie ideas, and I pitched him Corpses, which was very rough at that time, because I wasn't ready and I made it up on the spot. He liked it. I went home, wrote a 12-page treatment and met up with them. 2 months later, we were shooting." We start with our main kids driving across the country writing a book about the odd things that one might happen to find out in the desert wastes, when they happen to come across the most interesting thing that they will ever encounter in their soon-to-be shortly ended lives. Captain Spaulding's Museum of Monsters and Madmen, which, famously, serves both gasoline as well as hot fried chicken. The movie itself is very good. We wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't. But its real claim to its place in horror film history is Captain Spaulding, and the performance that Sid Haig gives here once they enter the gas station. Haig had been an actor for a long time, but at this point was basically retired, starring as minor villains in a lot of horror, blaxploitation, and action movies in the 60s and 70s. He acted roughly on up through 1990 or so, but now at this point in his life essentially was only doing cameos in Quentin Tarantino movies. But this film really gave a resurgence to him in the last 20 years of his life. The few minutes that he has on screen here really transformed him quickly into a horror movie god. He would begin acting again consistently until his death, and was also known to appear at a great deal of conventions. This movie literally changed his life, and we're lucky for it that it did. I know it is something that they could not have possibly predicted, obviously, but I do think that one thing that holds this film back is Rainn Wilson being one of the young victims here. Having Dwight Schrute walk around in these scenes post-office is just very jarring. There's no other way to put it. There are just some actors who become so physically synonymous with a character that it becomes almost surreal to see them in any other works. And for him, unfortunately, that happened, and makes you very externally aware that you're watching a movie anytime that he is on screen, instead of being invested in the moment. Which he actually looks surprisingly good here. He was supposed to be one of the young, early 20-something kids who gets killed, but was actually 37 when he filmed this part. The other male protagonist is played by Chris Hardwick, which is also somewhat distracting, although less so, because he's almost unrecognizable from the leaner, more mainstream TV host Ryan Seacrest knockoff look that he has today. The biggest criticism that you could place against this movie, and the work of Rob Zombie as a whole, which would be fair, is that this is basically a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. As soon after leaving Captain Spaulding's, the kids are tricked by a hitchhiker to go to a house that looks nearly identical from the one in that film, to meet a family of vaguely almost paranormal redneck killers, just like the ones in that movie. Zombie even cast Bill Moseley to play Otis, and directs him to give a performance that is just an older yet legally distinct version from Chop Top in Texas Chainsaw 2. Otis would eventually shift in the second film into being more of his own outright character, which makes sense as that film develops more of its own identity, which is reflected within and through its characters. Whereas in that movie, he has Otis giving a much more gruff voice, and more man-like masculine moves to his body and face. In this film, he has more of the boyish, teenager-like mannerisms of Chop Top. They also weirdly give him these pinkish contact lenses for the character, that implies that he's an albino in this movie, that they would also drop from the second one, and these lenses don't even look slightly natural, and are very distracting and get in the way of his performance. And this all does hold House of a Thousand Corpses back to some degree. It is a great work, sure, but ultimately all that could be said about it is that it is a great derivative work. It wears its inspirations so closely upon its sleeves, and as a result it never is allowed to mature into its own thing. As what starts as an amazing first act, revolving around Captain Spaulding and his gas station, turns into a flatter second act, where we are introduced to wild characters with extremely interesting features and flares, that is obviously supposed to be captivating, but it just feels like mimicries of things that we have already seen better executed in other films. For something that obviously was trying to be extremely boundary-pushing and transgressive, that constantly attempts to skirt the line between an R rating and an NC-17, it actually fails to deliver a follow-up that feels as energetic, fun, or actually transgressive as what it gives us in its opening scenes. Despite being the face of these movies, I would actually argue that Spaulding is horribly underused in strange ways across all three entries. With this one, he's hardly in it, because the twist at the end of the movie is that he has secretly been a member of the murderous family all along, and they just want you to think that he's just some helpless man who lives up the road for most of the runtime. Although, I don't know in what world you would think that this man is an innocent bystander. Especially after he shoots another man in the head in the first scene, rendering the twist at the end pointless. And if they had found a creative reason for him to go with the kids to the house to stay in the film, I think they might have been able to keep up some of that energy more than they were able to. Like, say their car broke down, and Spaulding said that he knew of a place that they could stay at, and then he takes them there himself. It would, I think, have greatly improved the second half of the movie. But then again, maybe the reason I like Spaulding so much is because Zombie shows restraint, and only gives me hints of him, and always leaves me wanting more. Although I did read at one point that there was a more practical reason as to why this may be the way that it is. As Zombie said that he wrote the part hoping that Haig would say yes, but at the time they had never even met each other, And he didn't want to build up this giant character in his script if he didn't know that the guy he was writing it for would even say yes to being in this crazy thing. He was practically retired after all. Around 2003, he said that if he could go back and include more Spaulding throughout the first film, then he probably would have. And it may sound like I don't like this, which is actually far from the truth. For a first film, it is extremely competent and shows an early glimpse of what Zombie would become known for, which is just pushing the concept of pure, grimy style as far as it can go. You know, I think as a filmmaker, he actually gets kind of a bad rap because of those Halloween films, something which I myself have probably added to. People talk so badly about those two movies, justifiably so, that they tend to kind of forget that he also made some of the more memorable and energetically joyful works of horror in the past 20 years. You know, I actually do think that if he had not been essentially trapped into making Halloween 1 and 2, that we would talk about him being among the greats of the genre of all time. And while at times he stumbles creatively in this first movie, it still looks amazing most of the time. And at the very least, he had a clear vision of what he wanted, and is executing it on a real masterful level. Like, I know he isn't, but the movie is just soaked in queer sensibilities, and I love that aspect of it. To me, it is one of the few films in history that at least a publicly straight man has successfully gotten close to doing fun camp well. Take away all the glamour, the rock sensibilities, the persona, and just look at the man himself, and you should hopefully be able to see that Zombie is a really interesting and intelligent dude. I highly recommend listening to some interviews with him, or at least some of his podcast appearances, because he's very thoughtful and well-spoken about why he does the things the way that he does. As an artist, I actually have a ton of respect for him. And when you hear him speak, he clearly does take everything involved with this very seriously, and has a great deal of love for film as an art form. Be it his De Palma editing style in the movie, with the consistent use of split screens, to his use of the song I Wanna Be Loved by You, down to even just the names of the characters who are all taken from Groucho Marx characters. Captain Spaulding is from Animal Crackers, Otis B. Driftwood from A Night at the Opera, Rufus T. Firefly from Duck Soup, and Hugo Z. Hackenbush from A Day at the Races. References to Betty Davis, the use of the song I Remember You, and Dragula in The Munsters being played on the television also pepper the film. And if you take his filmography as a whole, you can see a lot of love going on in it for classic Hollywood in most of his movies. All three of the ones in this series stop the action at some point, for characters to discuss amongst each other old black and white films. For some of the kill scenes, I believe probably to get an R rating, they switched to being VHS quality found footage-esque hand camera, with music and quick cuts, which actually I think stylistically does add to the film. When we cut back to the clear traditionally shot footage, it almost feels disappointing, because this world feels almost more natural and true to form when seeing it through a really shitty lens. Almost like how early Always Sunny or Trailer Park Boys works better than they do in their later seasons after they make the switch to HD. The low quality adds an extra needed greasy layer that is lost when seeing things as clearly as possible. This scene where this tactic is done actually seems to even be from a reshoot, and Zombie has said that the original version of the scene is probably lost forever, and that he would never be able to incorporate the footage back into an ultimate director's cut, because in the years since making it, no one has been able to locate anything that they originally shot. On this note, a lot of the scenes where the characters are talking directly to the camera that are also very lo-fi were actually filmed over a year after the actual production in Rob Zombie's basement, which explains why they don't tonally fit with the rest of the movie, and I would argue probably should have been excised. But in line with talking about the style of the film, some of this joking nature that Zombie instills into his world can also get in the way of him telling a story with real tension, such as this scene, where one of the girls wakes up tied to a bed hidden deep within the farmhouse, and it honestly begins very scary. This moment is tense. But then this atmosphere that he's trying to build is ruined by a double joke, as Tiny walks in to feed her breakfast, wearing a t-shirt that reads Bad Halloween Costume, and then gives her a bowl of cereal from a box titled Agatha Crispies. Things like this prevent the movie from ever feeling as upsetting or visceral as the movie that it is emulating. And I don't know that they are necessarily concerned with being as scary as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That would be a folly. And jokes like this in some scenes are fine, but it kind of is a consistent thing across all scenes in this first movie, and in my own personal opinion, prevents it from being anywhere close to consistent. But it does give it its own kind of identity as well. So there's a trade-off happening there stylistically, in which you prefer is entirely based on your own personal preferences. Whereas 2 and 3 are naturally funny because of the things that the characters say to each other, Here there's a lot more visual sight gags that pushes it more into the realm of goofy horror comedy. Because I guess the best way that you could look at this film is that if you took Texas Chainsaw Massacre and adapted it into a cartoon, and then you had a different team take that cartoon and readapt it back into an R-rated live-action movie for adults. Some things are going to be lost in that translation, but you gain some stuff along the way as well. I mean, the main villain that looms over this film is named Dr. Satan, which gives you the idea of the tone here. At the end of the day, all of these are basically just hangout movies. They essentially have next to no plot, and their enjoyment is just getting to watch these characters interact with each other and seeing the horrible destruction that they are capable of. Because after the kids get to the house, we then spend the rest of the movie watching bad things slowly happen to them while our antagonists do wacky things. Some would say that that's called spinning its wheels for an hour, but I think that's kind of the charm of it as a work. It is not concerned with being this grand, intricate thing. It's the love child of Texas Chainsaw smashed into the concepts of cottagecore and family home movies. The first of the two climaxes of the film is the first time that Zombie does one of his biggest trademark styles as a director, which is to have an entire sequence in slow motion set to a song. And not only that, but slow motion of shots that already don't have a lot of motion going on in them. And so instead you just get this story told through basically still images, and it always works when he goes for that. We will cover it more in the second one, but from the time the sheriff arrives at the farm, all the way to the final headshot at the end of the shootout, is just some of the best horror filmmaking of its era. For a musician, he doesn't actually use a lot of music in his movies, but when he decides to feature a song and build a whole sequence around it like he does in this moment, it really separates him on a skill level from some other more workman directors. The second climax is one that I loved when I was 15, but today, I'm pretty mixed on. The last 20 minutes or so of the film basically turns into an extended music video, where Otis, now dressed in ceremonial garb, burns the bodies of the victims who have perished throughout the movie on a pyre outside the home, while Denise realizes that the presumed-to-be dead infamous serial killer, Dr. Satan, has actually been alive the whole time, and has a whole compound of freaks that he lives with under the farmhouse, where he conducts strange and bizarre experiments on the victims that the family brings to him, via a complicated system of sending live bodies under the earth in caskets. All of this very much feels like an extension of that theme park idea, and kind of comes out of left field and makes little sense with what we've been shown in the rest of the story. We basically have 3 short films that make up this movie, and unfortunately, each of them gets weaker than the last. And while you've got a lot of cool visuals going on in the underground lair, it only works on a style level. It is ultimately serviceable, but you come away feeling like you've experienced 3 disjointed stories that don't entirely feel like they take place within the same world. Not a bad movie by any means, and at times is quite good, but also not one that I tend to revisit very often. Dr. Satan and his band of weirdos aren't even mentioned once in any of the sequels, so that gives you kind of the idea of what people thought about the end of this movie. It is essentially retconned into never having happened in the next one. A lot of what is surrounding this movie, both in its production as well as its post-production, was actually quite complicated, and made what should have been a relatively easy shoot kind of a pain for everyone involved. First off, Universal has always been big on making sure that some productions are always going on in their theme park studio lot, so that people can actually see movies and shows getting made when taking their studio tour. But this in reality resulted in a production where they were forced to try and record clear audio in the daytime next to an operating theme park, meaning that the great majority of the audio in the film was actually recorded in post-production, which is never fun for anyone to do. Also, remember how I said that Stacey Snider got dragged before Congress in 2000, around the time that they were making this movie to be questioned for Universal Studios supposedly making extreme content that children could possibly be exposed to? Well, in the time between that happening and them editing the film, 9/11 also happened. And as you remember, America acted very rationally in the years following 9/11. And throughout all of this, Universal got cold feet and canceled House of a Thousand Corpses, despite having spent millions of dollars on the film and the fact that it had already been fully completed. In the lead up to this, Zombie knew that things were not going extremely well for the film, when in a meeting he was told that the Captain Spaulding attraction at Universal was going to be rebranded into a more toned-down general thriller haunted house that wasn't even going to be specifically attached to the film. He recalled this later by saying, "Even though when you go in it's the giant Captain Spaulding sign, all the sets, the murder ride, when you're in line waiting to get in, it shows the trailer, interviews with the actors. It's unmistakably nothing else. They basically said, We don't want pictures of some underage kid getting into an attraction based on an R-rated movie right now. We don't need that hassle. I knew this was the shape of troubles to come. Zombie, due to pressures from Universal, began to film 2 versions of every scene, one rated R and the other more PG-13. And as I said earlier, some of that R-rated footage has in the years since mysteriously disappeared, and very well may have been destroyed by Universal to try and control the final edit of the movie, due to pressures from their congressional investigators into their business practices. They, in particular, according to him, hated the scene where Walton Goggins' cop character gets shot in the head, which Zombie says that he filmed in such a particular way, as to essentially force them to include it into the movie, only doing this one version of the shot so that it was all they were able to use. Since they do it in one take, you've either got to include the whole thing or just cut the scene, which the whole process was frustrating to him, as he would tell the AV Club. I was really blatant when I talked to them. I didn't want to get into a situation where they thought I was doing something mainstream, and I told them that I wanted to make a drive-in movie, something very gritty, nasty, and weird. Somewhere at the tail end of 2000 or at the very beginning of 2001, Universal did put out a trailer for the film. But as things continued to roll into 2001, and especially in the aftermath of 9/11, Universal and Zombie essentially became completely incompatible with their working relationship. And Zombie eventually received a call from Stacey Snider, saying that Universal had decided to drop the film from their release schedule. To which, Zombie did something that ended up being the right move, but at the time was exceptionally risky and ill-advised, and actually bought House of a Thousand Corpses from Universal with his own money. For a time, he was going to try and distribute the film himself, seemingly in a similar way that Kevin Smith has done for over a decade now by driving around and hosting screenings for a premium fee. This was done after a deal with MGM where they agreed to release the film in 2002, which fell through because Zombie talked so badly about Universal publicly that they were scared to go into business with him, out of a fear that he would then get mad at them for something and start talking badly about them publicly and damaging their reputation. But eventually, after several years of post-production hell, Lionsgate purchased the movie after wanting to get even more into horror, which is a space that they would dominate for the entirety of the 2000s. And the film was released in April of 2003, roughly 3 years after the movie had actually been shot.
Hi, you hungry? I'll slide into an oven-fresh bun, and I'm ready for your eating fun.
Why don't you try a juicy good hot dog? Delicious.
Despite being critically panned, House of a Thousand Corpses was a moderate success at the box office, but then became extremely popular when it hit home video, and a sequel was very quickly made to be released just over 2 years later. Basically, Lionsgate, according to Zombie, greenlit the movie after the first day that the film was released, after they had made all of the money they had invested in it back before the opening weekend was concluded. Not because it was doing all that particularly well at the theater, but more so just because everything had been done so cheaply. This sequel would similarly have issues surrounding its production, but not as many as the first one did. The only major thing is that it had to go through the MPAA 8 times before it finally received an R rating. In my opinion, The Devil's Rejects is one of the finest horror films that has ever been made. I would easily place it in the top 50 of all time, and far away surpasses the first entry, which was already great in its own right, which is a rarity. Where the first film was a stylish knockoff that was brought down by its attachment to visual tropes of horror cinema of the early 2000s, including whooshing sounds with quick edits, that was very common then, especially in trailers. Here we get a much more mature film that feels like it was made by an entirely different man, despite the fact that it was only released 2 years later in 2005. The growth as a filmmaker that Zombie makes between his first and second movie is honestly kind of astonishing to see. Where in that one, we got a film of its era through and through, that only had hints of 70s styling and flair. This one really actually tries to emulate a lot of what made 70s horror so raw. Stylistically, this was achieved by Zombie just hiring people who actually worked in movies in the 1970s, which, just makes sense to do. He hired Phil Parmet to act as the cinematographer, who worked on concert films in the 70s such as Led Zeppelin's The Song Remains the Same and Frank Zappa's Baby Snakes, as well as multiple handheld documentaries in the 70s. And the tone of legitimacy that this lends to the film is not even quantifiable. You just feel it when you see the footage from this movie. There's just no other way to describe it. It just looks great. The way that the film starts is something that I would normally take issue with, like I did in my review of the Resident Evil series. as The Devil's Rejects basically starts with a clean slate wipe of the events of the previous movie, where the police show up to raid the farmhouse, and in the shootout that ensues, basically every character from the first film is either killed or captured, outside of Otis and Baby. Everything about this intro feels like it takes place in a totally different reality from our first movie, and was made by an entirely different team. I imagine that the police are raiding the house because of the cops that went to investigate at the end of the last film who got killed. But Otis has grown a full beard between now and then. The house itself is obviously also totally different, as they couldn't use the one from the Universal lot after the fallout that happened there. This whole thing kind of serves to say, yes, this is a sequel, but also, that doesn't matter. This is an entirely new beast. This is done to segue us into a new reality for the series, that is more grounded and steeped in actual violence, in a way that the first film wasn't entirely. Despite its very aggressive title, that movie was actually pretty tame all around except for a couple scenes that go hard. But this verges on being outright vile at times, kind of evil incarnate. A film much more focused on our own reality, so much so that it feels outright bizarre when Tiny shows up at the end, because by that point you've forgotten where all of this started. Sherry Moon Zombie at the time even said that the film really should not be seen as connected to what came before, telling Fangoria. It's more like some of the characters from House of a Thousand Corpses came on over, and now they're the Devil's Rejects. Otis, now removed from his spirituality that made up his character in the first film, is all around a much more compelling entity that helps to drive this story here for its more grounded feel. I would argue that Bill Moseley was actually too young to play Otis in the first movie. But here 5 years later, with the addition of the beard that he has, and the gruffness and performance required to do this, that was missing in his first go-around, he's kind of perfect. I would say that while I do love him, his performance was a little lackluster in House of a Thousand Corpses. But in Devil's Rejects, he commands attention. He has such a screen presence that launches him into the canon of all-time great horror characters. Every scene that he's in is extremely disturbing in a great way. In that first movie, he is essentially an evil priest. But in this one, he is basically retconned into being Charles Manson. And you would think that that change would be jarring, but honestly this performance is so good that it is welcomed quite easily. I mean, has anyone ever been as hot as Bill Moseley is in The Devil's Rejects? Because I don't think that they have, outside of maybe Bill Moseley in Prisoner of a Ghostland. Like I said before, all of these movies are plotless hangout movies. They're very slice of life. And so what you have here is basically the best horror road trip movie ever made. After the raid from the police, we essentially just have 2 hours of the worst people that you've ever met running for their lives across the American South, as we witness their final path of destruction along the way. If you were to ask me to recount the plot of any of these movies, it would be kind of a difficult task, as it feels like kind of simultaneously a great deal happens while nothing really happens at all either. We just watch bad but charismatic people do horrible, unimaginable things to innocents for 2 hours and then the movie's over. Which, in the hands of most filmmakers, would make for a terrible movie. But this is done with such style and personality, and dare I say grace, that you can't help but love it. I've never shown this movie to someone who didn't like it. A truly universal movie. One of my biggest criticisms of this film, though, comes in the form of its first act, in that it is undeniably a road trip. But you know how certain television shows will have a famous person in their cast, and they will go to great lengths to keep them on the show, even if it doesn't really make sense for them to still be there, including if that means giving them their own subplot entirely separate from the main cast as an excuse to allow the famous person to film in their free time when they're available. An example is how it's really obvious that Laverne Cox, after season 2, got way too famous to be on Orange is the New Black. And so then from every season from then on, they seemingly would film around her schedule, and would either have her in solitary confinement or being a nurse off by herself in the medical ward, always separated from the main cast because they almost certainly filmed all of her stuff independently. This at times feels like that does. And I don't really know why this was done on an artistic level, because very rarely do movies feel burdened by that issue. Because for a great deal of this runtime, we have Otis, Baby, and Captain Spaulding, off on their own doing side quests by themselves. Which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Number one, because the movie's called The Devil's Rejects and the cover is them walking together. And two, because the appeal of these wild characters is how they bounce off of each other while committing their crimes. And when they're isolated like this, by themselves, you get less of that fun banter going on, which is a bit of a shame. Even if this does result in some of the best scenes of the movie, such as Otis out in the desert making the men dig their own graves. Or like when Captain Spaulding assaults a woman and tells her child that he's going to kill their whole family while stealing their car. Just the chaotic joyfulness in his performance makes this one of the funniest horror scenes of all time. The way he asks the boy why he doesn't like clowns by saying,
"Don't we make you laugh? Aren't we fucking funny?"
is one of the best 2000s horror moments. It's a line that I repeat in my broken brain uncontrollably like 10 times a week. Our main characters do not share the screen together until over a full hour into the movie. And while there's a lot of great moments in that hour, ultimately I think this was a bit of a misstep. The team just works best when they're working together, because their personalities and performances really shine when talking amongst themselves, rather than having just one crazy person bouncing off of your average, terrified, run-of-the-mill country American. If I had one other complaint, it is that while it is doing a lot better than House of 1000 Corpses did with being its own original work, that does not rely too heavily on past horror films, it is at times still very referential. One of the biggest examples of this is when Otis makes one of his victims wear the face of her own father, a callback to Bill Moseley's first film, Texas Chainsaw 2, where Leatherface makes Stretch wear her friend's face. In this same mindset, I also really do not like a scene that comes in the middle of the film, where Zombie gets very metatextual, by including a self-insert parody character of himself. As the police start to realize that all of our killers have taken their names from Groucho Marx movies, and they bring in a film historian to help them on the case, which just gives Zombie 5 minutes to both flaunt his film history knowledge, and also kind of poke fun at your average stereotype of a film buff. But in the grand scheme of things, this scene ultimately serves no purpose, other than to demonstrate that he knows more about movies than you think that he would. And it overall kills the pacing of the movie, and stands out strangely as the only overtly stylistically filmic comedic scene, and hurts the tone as a result. All other funny scenes are funny because they are depicting cartoonishly evil acts by characters that are acting joyful. The humor is just derived from the fact that people are just funny creatures. It is weirdly humanistic, despite the cruelty-based context of the scenes, juxtaposed to this moment, which is more self-aware, and blatantly says that this is all taking place within the reality of a fictional film. This scene to me feels like it was ripped out of the same universe that House of 1000 Corpses takes place in. There are other ways that the film is referential that are less jarring, in particular related to its casting. Michael Berryman is in this obviously to tie the film thematically to The Hills Have Eyes, another huge inspiration for these movies. And Ken Foree is here as well from Dawn of the Dead, more so because he's cool and not because Dawn of the Dead has any particular connection to The Devil's Rejects. Which in that though, his role is weirdly referential in two ways. As it ties into the history of horror, of course, that one is obvious, but also it comments on the bigger picture of the film itself being a sequel. Because weirdly, The Devil's Rejects as a whole is actually just a giant parody of Empire Strikes Back, with Foree's character filling the Lando Calrissian role, who is someone who is extremely charismatic and has a distinct fashion sense, who used to run with our gang of rebels back in the day, and now has gone mostly straight with his legal but still dubious brothel business, but takes his old friends in and hides them when they're on the run from the authorities, before ultimately betraying them and selling them out for money in the end. We start with an attack on the rebel base. Our two heroes escape through a tunnel, with another one doing a mission out on his own. All three do not get back together again until well over halfway through the film. Their old friend acts hostile at first with a gun as a joke, but then he drops that front and greets them with open arms. A friend who also happens to have a bold, distinct-looking sidekick that helps him out. We have dream sequences that we first think are reality related to our characters' fathers. And we end with our rebel protagonist being tortured by the figure that is representative of the law of the state, ending in such a way that feels extremely ominous for the future of our characters. But still, there's a gleam of hope, as our rebels possibly escape to fight another day. Structurally, the movies are almost identical, which has to have been done on purpose, right? And would probably have been lost on most people, I imagine, but I do think it is very funny. But going back to the tone of the film, the uncomfortableness of this as a work really lies in the idea that unlike most horror films, all of this is presented from the viewpoints of our slasher villains. An idea that you would think would be common but honestly is pretty exceedingly rare to do. Movies like Taxi Driver, Fade to Black, Pearl, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, Nightcrawler, American Psycho, and Under the Skin all present a similar challenge to the audience of making us see these acts through the eyes of the person perpetrating them, and are not so much asking us to identify with them, but they at least attempt to make us try to understand these highly broken people and their psychology, of why they commit destruction like this to such a degree. We are asked to understand their inner traumas and turmoil, which leads to an external explosion of violence. And basically, every time this is done in pop fiction, it becomes a pretty successful movie. So I don't know why this isn't attempted more often, other than the fact that movies with nuance are hard to write. The victims are not actually the protagonists of this movie. Every scene is given from the perspective of the killers, which is such a negative energy to be forced to sit with in this one in particular. Other movies like this, such as American Psycho or American Mary, are at times quite funny with their kill scenes. But during moments of great violence in this, there is zero humor. There is just a vengeful god and his peons. It is through this that, in a way, The Devil's Rejects can be a very challenging movie for some. It is oppressively bleak and hostile to its audience. It does not care what you think of any of this. I mean, we watch Otis rape a woman and kill several men among other horrible things. But then there's this wholesome scene soon after where he goes and gets ice cream with his friends. The banality of evil capable in mankind on display is the point, and the movie should not be as fun as it is. And the fact that you do have a great time with it is almost a challenge to the audience on the nature of entertainment and spectacle, as well as just the superficial charm of these people. It is also a demonstration of just how talented these actors are, because very, very few people could walk this line within a film successfully. The fact that we don't hate Otis, Baby, and Captain Spaulding by the end of it is actually kind of a miracle. It is a movie ultimately about pure nihilism and the dangers of people who believe in nothing but the cosmic violence of the universe. I think this is most on display when Otis is torturing two of his victims who dared to fight him off, and he says to them, "Do you want to see what happens to heroes? Do you want to see what happens to badass motherfuckers? I want you to pray to your god. I want you to pray that he comes and saves you. I want lightning to come down and crash upon my fucking head," before beating them to death with a stick in the southwestern desert, and leaving their bodies to decay in the sun and the dust. Another shot that always gets me near the end of the film is when we cut to the hitman laughing hysterically to himself, after callously shooting one of the prostitutes who just happened to be a bystander in all of this just for the fun of it. At its heart, it is a movie, not just about evil, but also on if evil is really a thing, or instead a construct of a polite world. On if people are just people, and this existence is Hobbesian and cruel. I think something that Zombie does not get enough credit for is his use of liminal locations like gas stations and roadside motels, as the meeting grounds of potentially violent people across the landscape of the American South. In areas that are so exceptionally rural, these cultural crossroads are some of the only places where some people will ever see other people in their isolated days. And the fact that they're so often used in these movies I think is very true to life and its chosen setting. The final moments of The Devil's Rejects I think is a top-tier horror ending of all time, I really do. Where our killers have barely escaped the brothel with their lives, and are driving the American landscape essentially bleeding to death. Captain Spaulding is passed out in the back from his excessive wounds, Baby's not doing much better, and Otis is the only one conscious enough to get them to safety, but then he just stops. And there's this look in his eye, and we see that he's been met by a whole line of police, who aim to end the three of them in a hail of gunfire. No arrests, end of the line. And we get just mostly still images, and the music keeps playing, and without a word you get this visual coda that represents who these people are. They are violence incarnate. They are Satan. They are blood, they are vengeance, and they are pain. It is just intercut shots of them walking through a field, laughing and holding hands in a world that seems much nicer than it truly is, mixed with them preparing to wield fiery destruction one last time in the face of certain death by the hand of the law. A grand fuck you to the world and anything that pretended to have any authority or meaning over the chaos of existence. One final act of true rebellion before the lights go out. It is to me a perfect ending for these characters, showing their final moments in their comfort and embrace of brutality, where life and death are both meaningless, and pain is God. The film would make quite a lot at the box office, and would even be critically well received. Surprisingly, even Roger Ebert gave the movie a mostly positive review. It won several awards and became a cultural work within certain aspects of the internet, in particular with horror fans. To say that it is a well-loved cult classic at this point would probably be fair, but the movie ends with all of our characters seemingly getting blasted away. Roll credits. The end. That's all, folks.
Sid,
What?
is there going to be another Devil's Rejects?
No.
Why? Because we're fucking dead.
There was never really any talk of doing a sequel, and little plausible room within the reality of the story to make that work. And one was not also really expected from the fans either. In fact, if you go back and look at internet posts from more than a few years ago, you can find examples of people saying how glad they are that both Zombie and Lionsgate showed restraint and didn't force a sequel into something that didn't necessarily fit, and that these movies remained a duology, instead of being ruined by unnaturally forcing it into being a trilogy. The characters would be used from time to time in little things, silly videos like a Captain Spaulding Christmas commercial, as well as making cameo appearances in the short film The Haunted World of El Superbeasto. But outside of that, there was never even really substantial rumors that another full-length film was ever going to be made. But in 2018, Zombie announced that they were going to come back and do one last one that would release the next year titled 3 from Hell. Zombie would tell Rocco Thompson at Rue Morgue on how this came to be. I'm not exactly sure. It never really went out of my mind, because the characters never really go out of my mind. They seem pretty present all the time. But it wasn't really until about 3 years ago that I thought, you know what, I might actually try to do this. So I went into Lionsgate and talked to some of the executives that I worked with on The Devil's Rejects, and they seemed down with the project. From there, we just sort of started developing it and doing all the boring stuff that leads up to getting a movie made. Sherry obviously knew about it first and was skeptical because she was like, well, I really like Rejects. It ended well, do we really want to do this? But when she read the script, she was like, okay, I'm in on this. Then we got everyone together. Me, Sherry, Bill, and Sid had lunch to discuss the project and everything. From there, it just kept rolling forwards. Which, it is kind of surprising that this movie got made, and the fact that it did can be debated on if that was a good thing or not for the overall legacy of the first two films. Costing only $2 million to make, it was working with a micro budget that was less than half of either House of a Thousand Corpses or The Devil's Rejects, which were already very cheaply made movies. And this can be felt across the entire runtime. They just simply did not have enough funds to actually make this movie. I mean, even looking at the logo, it feels like someone trying to do something as a pastiche to an older style, but not fully hitting the mark. The flat, untextured colors with no film grain overlay, like we're used to seeing with the series, makes it feel like a cheap Photoshop job, as opposed to a real 70s intro sequence. Which is especially upsetting considering Zombie's normal commitment to visuals and fine details. If anyone knows how important that is to long-term success, it's him. I mean, listen to how he described using visuals as a musical artist, and how that led him to initial success 20 years ago, when he was speaking with Sam Dunn. And then compare his old words to his new work in 3 from Hell, and you can see unfortunately that a bit of his own sauce is missing, which I think can somewhat be attributed to the budget. I never just saw music as music, I saw it as one big thing. I was as obsessed with the t-shirts and the stage show as I was the music. It was all important, it was all one big thing. And sometimes people aren't about that. Like bands will be about the music and say, the image and all this, that doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? Trust me, if Jimi Hendrix was a big fat bald guy, we wouldn't still be talking about him. But he was this really cool looking guy, right? Same thing with Jim Morrison or whoever. If Jim Morrison looked like Orson Welles, we wouldn't be listening to The Doors right now. But to me, unfortunately, 3 from Hell is kind of the Orson Welles of the trilogy. And there's a bit of a flawed nature to his logic. I would argue that both Orson Welles and Sid Haig are both older, heavy men, but were still interesting looking people that we still do talk about today. But you get the sentiment of what he's referring to here. Instead of an action scene of Otis escaping from prison like we would have gotten in Rejects, we cut to the aftermath of that scene that cost a lot less to do. This, even more than the others, is very slice of life. Many scenes of them just talking about movies and hanging out, which is the lifeblood of the series. But you get the feeling in this one that it was done out of budgetary reasons, rather than artistically based stylistic ones. Another effect that the budget has on the movie is that the killers are no longer now in control, because in the other movies where they are in control, they have lots of carnage, which costs money. But here they are constantly shown in defensive situations, hiding out in the wilderness, because that's cheaper to pull off. But as an effect, it harms the overall manic tone that the first few movies excelled at, and also affects our perception of these characters. And the limited violence that is here is also harmed for similar reasons. Almost all of the blood and gun effects are now done with cheap CGI, with the worst examples being the shootout near the end, such as this scene where these close-range shotgun hits look like normal handgun bullets. Shotguns have exceptional power behind them that would rip a man apart at close range, and these little blood sprays come across as almost comical. But just because it is cheaper does not mean that it is not an overall weak or lazy work in entirety, as style is still attempted to be at the forefront of this movie. The dance sequence near the end, for example, is a standout to me, with its use of color and De Palma split screen. And also a few scenes before that, where a normal moment of dialogue is highlighted by what I assume are out-of-focus string lights that hang right in front of the camera lens, giving it a really great but still cheap, effective feel. If you go back to Devil's Rejects, you see him using a lot of cranes for shots, and fast motion photography of the car on the highway. Just the whole thing is great, and you don't really get a lot of that here because of the money. You do get one single shot like this over the end credits, but I would bet based on the look of it that it is actually repurposed unused footage that they originally filmed back in 2005 for The Devil's Rejects. But the main issue that looms over this film is that it was written as a direct sequel to The Devil's Rejects, and they had already gotten the money and were in the process of building sets and securing locations and hiring crew, before Sid Haig would fall ill and have to back out of the film. Meaning that the script had to be rewritten on the fly, often on the same day as filming, to remove Spaulding from the story. And you can really feel this in the final product. And I would have loved to have seen a 3 from Hell made just a few years previously, because as a work of art, it just comes across as being made slightly too late. He would tell Entertainment Weekly, "The movie that I prepped to make and was getting ready to start shooting, it was Captain Spaulding, Otis, and Baby, the 3 originals. But 3 weeks out from shooting, I got a call from Sid Haig. He had been in the hospital, and he had just had surgery, and he was now recovering in a rehabilitation facility. And I'm like, holy shit, this is a serious business." So I went to see him, and he had changed drastically from the last time I saw him. Because Sid, he's big and burly, and now he's tiny as a skeleton. So I was like, oh man. I kind of realized, yeah, he's in rough shape. So at that point, I was kind of fucked. I created this character Foxy for Richard Brake. I had just worked with Richard on a movie called 31, and I knew he would fit the vibe. He was on another movie in Spain shooting. He flew right from that movie to LA, and started working instantly. A lot of the scenes with Foxy were supposed to be Spaulding, and I twisted things around so I didn't have to rewrite every single thing. It was the funniest situation and the shittiest situation, because I went from one moment thinking this is the most prepared I have ever fucking been to start a movie. Everything is locked down tight. And within one phone call, the entire production went into complete chaos for 3 weeks. But at the end of the day, it all worked out great. He would further elaborate in his Rue Morgue interview. So I started rewriting, thinking, okay, maybe it's 2 from Hell, or maybe I'd bring back this character or that one. But it's hard to bring people back, because I always kill them off. That's when I hit upon the idea of creating a new character, and since I'd just worked with Richard, I knew that he would fit the vibe and fit in with everybody. I didn't even know if he was available, so I called him. He flew to California and basically had 1 second to try on some wardrobe, and then we were shooting. He just jumped right in. At first, obviously, I was like, where does this character fit in with these other characters that are already fully established? But we found a groove, and it worked really well. Spaulding is only in one scene of the final film, looking emaciated and very ill, but still is able to muster some of that Captain Spaulding magic one last time, although be it with some deterioration to that energy from age. Actually, I think that this is the most disturbing that he ever was in his career. This scene contextually within the film is the final interview with Spaulding moments before he's scheduled to receive the lethal injection. And honestly, you can kind of feel that Haig is mustering the fact that he's in the process of dying, to really give his few seconds here an extremely memorable and upsetting send-off to the character and to his career. It is the only time in these movies that he feels like he might have actually been a genuine serial killer in his free time when he wasn't on screen. Zombie would say on this, "I knew it was so important he being a part of the movie. Lionsgate was fine with me sneaking him in for 1 day to shoot as much as I could. It was on me to make sure that nothing went wrong, so I got him in. I shot everything I could shoot." Sid Haig would sadly pass away 5 days after the film was released. As he said, Richard Brake from 31, who you'd also know as the Night King from Game of Thrones, replaces his role in the script as Foxy, Otis's long-lost brother that we have never heard of before now. Which, I love Brake. I think he can actually be quite scary and is one of the few actors who are able to deliver consistently disturbing and genuinely upsetting performances. And he is really good in this, do not get me wrong, but he and Mosley are basically giving the same performance here. Which makes sense because, they are supposed to be brothers. But there's a tangible lack of any natural, manic humor between them that Spaulding would have provided to these scenes. And I really hate that we didn't get an opening act of Otis having to travel the countryside with just Captain Spaulding as his companion, as they hide out from the law. I think that would have been a lot of fun. But also, that's not really something that is necessarily fair to fault the film with. Life is life after all, and things do happen. And considering the circumstances, the movie could have ended up being a whole lot worse than it is. Another reason why I say that it feels like a movie that was made too late is due to the ages of the actors. They had to include a time jump to make all of this make sense. The movie now takes place in the 1980s, almost in 1990. Our characters have been in prison for about a decade, but the overall filmic tone and fashion is still very Manson family 60s and 70s, with a vibe that had really died out by that point, even in the South. And they could have used that as a commentary about how when they leave prison they're now culturally stuck in the past from where they came, that the world has left them behind while they were in this time capsule. But the movie is not interested in exploring this very much, unfortunately. It never really is mentioned, and instead it takes the less interesting route of opting to just have the movie take place in its own alternative world, where the culture and look of the 70s never really ended. This movie, even more than the other ones, is concerned with the real-life Manson murders. All three really can, in their own way, be seen as a fictional riff on the Spawn Ranch events. And even though there are clear Texas Chainsaw inspirations going on here too, Zombie himself has theorized that Chainsaw is merely an extension of the late 60s Manson craze, and that the first Texas Chainsaw movie in the early 70s about a crazed family of people out in the heat of the desert would have never even been conceived of if the country had not just gone through that huge cultural moment. But in this movie, having survived their hail of gunfire, taking more than 20 bullets each, our killers seemingly rejected from hell itself for being so evil still walk the earth, and are publicly placed on trial for their crimes against the very idea of life itself. And with the trial, you get people who are for the three and against the three, and I don't particularly find a lot of that very interesting. These people are a lot more compelling when we get to watch and judge them for ourselves, not when we watch other people watch them. Being the Charles Manson stand-in that he is, Zombie in each of these movies basically gives Otis lines to say that just directly outright state what the thesis of the movie is. With one of his first lines in this one when he's being interviewed on the television being, "Hello America, did you miss me? I am Satan's destroyer. I am the eternal flame of salvation burning through your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of fucking happiness." Which, funny enough, even though it is the weakest film in the series, it is also the most consistent with its messaging of being anti-government and authority, of living a life unbridled for yourself with no regard of how your actions affect anything, of being a being of greed and destruction, whose only goal is to eat and see another day, of spitting in the eye of anything that claims to represent authority. The warden at one point tells Otis that, "This is my death factory and you are the product." In a later scene, someone mockingly tells a wounded Otis that he should have stayed out of prison, because leaving has only been a hazard to his well-being, to which he said, "At this point, life seems hazardous to my health." The rejects exist in an America that is so hostile to someone who walks a different path, that, not unlike Manson, they rage out at their ignorance and consumerism, and presumed false safety within their homes. They're walls that make them forget that the world is animals who eat other animals, and that if you don't start eating, then you better be ready to be a meal yourself. Again, the movie is not necessarily saying that this is good, justified, or right, but more so is just presenting their perspective on things and telling you to think about them as people. I would argue structurally that this movie is much more similar to House of 1000 Corpses than Devil's Rejects, and that like that work, it is basically 3 short films under one roof. The first being about the aftermath of the shootout, their trial, and eventual break from prison, that is basically parroting the Manson trials as well as women in prison movies of that era. A second darker midsection based on them trying to lay low while news broadcasts can be seen on every television in the country. And a third colorful daytime hideaway to Mexico, that is supposed to be their gateway to a better life that ends with another fateful shootout. There are some things structurally taken from Rejects. Our gang for a second time does not share the screen together until roughly an hour into the film, and ultimately I think that one could say that Zombie is trying to emulate his favorite things from both movies, which is both good and bad, as Three from Hell often ends up feeling like a greatest hits album more than its own unique work. For instance, the sequence where Otis and Foxy take the prison warden's family hostage in their home is basically a worse remix of the family in the motel from the last movie. Later, Foxy in bed with a woman in Mexico under a very distinct mural is the exact same kind of scene as an earlier one in Rejects, with Spaulding and a woman under a clown mural in his home. Some would say that is poetic mirroring, thematic imagery and use of repetition of scenes or moments. But one could also argue that the film leans on these things too often, instead of trying to say or do something that is wholly unique. Both House and Rejects have their own distinct filmic and stylistic identities, and justify their own existence to be made. But this is more of a half-empty reflection, a work that is more concerned with how cool The Devil's Rejects was than really anything else. People have always made fun of Sheri Moon Zombie, who plays Baby in these movies, saying that she's a bad actor to the point that it has basically become a meme, which is something that I don't actually agree with anymore at all. I think she's serviceable in the first one, but legitimately great in the second one. But here, after a decade in prison, she gives Baby this much more unhinged Joker way of speaking that is genuinely very awful. And Zombie himself should be blamed for some of this as well, because a lot of these lines would sound bad coming from anyone, and he was directing her performance on top of that. It is really hard to write a violently mentally unwell, delusional character and not come across as emotionally false. But the combination of his script and her performance makes Baby damn near unwatchable in the early parts of this movie. She's basically the main character for the first act, and all of her scenes are pretty hard to watch. Later in the film, there's also this weird callback scene to Rejects, focused around her, that really only exists as a cheap way to fill out time. There's no narrative significance to the moment, and it leaves you wondering why it's here. Where Baby in Mexico enters a knife-throwing competition to see who can get the closest to stabbing the dummy in the heart. And we all know from the last movie that Baby is exceptionally good at hitting hearts with knives from across a room. And I thought they were building up to her doing another cool underhand throw like she does in that movie, which is a really standout moment in my mind. But for some reason they have her do it overhand, and it just leaves you wondering why even include any of this here at all. It leaves it feeling aimless. But I guess that could be said of most scenes in most slice-of-life works. Ultimately, the back half of this is fine. We get scenes of the family being family together, which is the heart and emotional pull that takes us through their road of carnage and death. But even in Mexico, they're not safe. They're never going to leave this life behind, and the ghosts of their past again come back to haunt them. And still away from the Empire of America and their rules and social pretenses and authoritarianism, are forced to live an existence quantified by blood and by pain. There's nothing new here. It is ultimately demonstrating the same lessons that Rejects had 15 years previously. But that also doesn't mean that it's bad. I actually quite like it as a movie. It is ultimately a little empty. It pales in comparison to the last film, but probably is about as good as the first one was. And I don't hate that it got made. I just worry that in the long road ahead, it might slightly diminish The Devil's Rejects as a cultural work, which now will always not be seen as its own mostly standalone thing, but instead the middle section of a somewhat middling trilogy. And for that reason, I don't know if Three from Hell justifies its aims and aspirations enough for the harm that it may cause to its own legacy. But for better or worse, the film does exist. It did decently well on home video from what I can tell, and at least made its money back. And critically, it got what would be expected. And as far as Zombie is concerned, this will be the last thing that he ever does with this universe. As he told Entertainment Weekly, it's probably the end. End of the road.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
strong.